Good afternoon, and welcome to a presentation on fear and loathing. It's the odd and sometimes unexplained behavior of politics and race. Sometimes race and politics can make unusual, if not difficult, really difficult, bedfellows. Think about those conversations that become awkward, even difficult when the idea of race is brought up. What happens when you're making that point and you start to stumble because race just got let into the room? What happens when things go unexpectedly left? Think about oil and water. My name is Asher Hamilton, and I am the coordinator of the Office of Student Engagement here at Cape Cod Community College. Now, why am I here today? Because these critical conversations around race are necessary. When that awkwardness comes into the room, it's important that we're able to discuss those difficulties around race and politics. Now, you see, young voters are pivotal to any election, absolutely instrumental. They play a key role in determining many of the salient issues of today. Race and ethnicity have always played key roles in any election. At times, the role of race and ethnicity in politics has seemed insignificant, while at other times it's creeped in and infringed upon almost every discussion. Now, nearly 66 years after the Supreme Court landmark decision in the Brown versus Board of Education, it is only fitting that we invite a distinguished scholar to foresees to address the question of how much does race matter in American politics? Now, join us this afternoon with Dr. Rachel Navarre from Bridgewater State University on fear and loathing, the behavior of politics and race. Now, who is Dr. Rachel Navarre? She is from, like I said, Bridgewater State University. Let me read to you a few of her credentials. She is the assistant professor in the political science department at Bridgewater. She is a postdoctorate fellow for the Center for Inter-American Policy and Research, right from New Orleans. Her education, she received her PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. She also received her master's degree in government from the University of Texas at Austin. A little bit about her background and her research. She's written on measuring simultaneous emotions and existing problems in the new way forward. She's also written on immigration politics in the 21st century. She's written Good Fences Make Good Neighbors, Trump Policy, and the New View from Latin America. Some of her current research is populism and conspiracy. She's also written on new media, new parties, and the social media campaigns in Spain. Also, immigration in a time of crisis, COVID-19, elite cues, and immigration bans. She's also written on constructing immigrants on campaign trail, Twitter, immigration, and the 2016 US presidential election. Last but not least, and why she's here with us today, fear or loathing, the effective political economy of prejudice. Now, Dr. Navarre is a researcher who has practiced at using evidence to come to a conclusion. The data that she will provide today will be left for you to make an educated decision on what is going on and why. She's not here today to talk about partisan politics or deliver her opinion on who or who is not the better candidate running for any office. Today, she's here to talk about fear and loathing, the behavior of politics and race. Dr. Navarre, welcome to Cape Cod Community College and to this informal talk. Dr. Navarre?
Well, thank you very, very much for that extremely kind and warm introduction. I'm very glad to be here today and to talk a little bit about my research. Okay, so let me open up to share my screen. I'm going to put my PowerPoint up. I'll take just a second and let me, there we go. All right, so this work is work that I've done with two other co-authors. We have Dr. Rhodes Purdy, who is at Clemson, and Steve Utech, who's at Boise State, another BSU. But before I get into really what we found, we started this research project because we wanted to know what is the relationship between economics, emotion, and populism. So, we started seeing you have the economic crisis of 2008, you have the Euro crisis, you have the real estate crisis in the United States that really affects a lot of people very drastically. And we see the rise of populist parties, not just in America or populist sentiments in America, but we also see the rise of populist parties worldwide in Europe, Latin America, and other places. But we also see the rise of ethno-national populists. Okay, so people that want to restrict immigration, have very sort of racialized politics. Okay, but the other thing is we also saw anger and populism on the left. Okay, so we also saw that leftists were not very happy with the way things were going. So before we get too far into this, what do I mean when I say a populist? Populism is a term that is often misused in the media. But a populism is just an anti-liberal movement. And by liberal, I mean liberal political ideology. Okay, so the ideology that you get when you have, that you get the word liberalism from or libertarian from. This is the idea that we should have constitutional protections that make sure we don't have mob rule either by the minority or the majority, and that there are constitutional protections and limits on what the government can do. Okay, but this is a movement that kind of divides the population into two groups. We have the good, hardworking people and the selfish, evil elites who are working against the common good or the people in general. So who is a populist? A populist is someone who claims to represent the will of the people. They deny the existence of divisions between the people. If you don't agree with them, then you are obviously one of the elites, or you are obviously one of the non-people. You're one of the people working against them. Now, as one of the writers about populism notes, and this is my favorite way to describe populism, is that populists aren't always wrong about the issues they see in society. They are very, good at pointing out issues that modern democracies have. But they tend to do it more like your obnoxious uncle at the Thanksgiving dinner table. Their solutions aren't always the best, or they're not very polite about it. Okay? But at their heart, they are a liberal. They prefer referendums, which is where people can vote on things in general, but you don't have those constitutional protections that the minority, and remember, minority in this sense can mean, it's very much the Madisonian term of minority. It can be an ethnic minority, it could be an economic minority, it could be a religious minority, whatever. But you don't have the constitutional protections. The will of the majority is what goes, and that is it. And then, of course, once they get into power, like Chavez, they don't have to hold elections anymore because the populists somehow they know the will of the people, and therefore they can just kind of divine it. So at some point, you don't even have to have elections anymore. So what is the connection? So why do we see these prejudice or, ethno-national parties seem to rise in tandem with financial crisis and other major economic threats? And the thing is, the supporters of these movements tend not to be the poorest or those that we would consider left behind. We wondered, how does attacking or being critical of another group soothe your concerns over your economic threats that often have very little to do with the group that's being targeted? We also wanted to know is, do these threats somehow lead to non-prejudiced people becoming prejudiced, or do they simply intensify the salience of existing negative attitudes and biases? And finally, we wanted to know, well, but this isn't true of everyone, okay? So some people, when they react to crises, they do become more committed to racial and ethnic hierarchies. But other people turn to radical egalitarian ideas like socialism and left-wing populism. We see this with Bernie Sanders. We see this with democratic socialists in the US, for example. Syriza in Greece and Podemos are examples of this kind of left-wing egalitarianism. So we kind of think that the connection here is emotion. So threats cause anger and fear, which in turn can increase prejudice, which then can lead to increased likelihood of collective action against outgroups. And the question we seek to answer here is, do anger and anxiety influence prejudice in the same manner, or does one have more of an effect than the other? So our theory is that the connection between emotional crisis and prejudice, it operates through this emotional response. Okay, so it is not the economic threat per se that causes increasing prejudice, but rather prejudice rises due to the emotions that the threat triggers. Now, when individuals are angry, they will rely, and this is work that has been done by others in the field, they tend to rely on existing predispositions. So this increases the salience of their aggressive attitudes. So for prejudicial attitudes, this means that the negative attitudes towards group that the individual is already prejudiced towards will increase. So we're not saying that, if you did not have prejudice towards ethnic or racial minorities, you're going to experience an economic crisis and boom, you're going to suddenly have these prejudice. These prejudice are instead latent feelings that you already have. You're already predisposed to dislike a certain group. And the economic crisis basically just brings that to the forward by raising these emotions. Okay. Now, anxiety, the literature is a little bit less clear about what anxiety makes us do. So anxious individuals do rely less on their pre-existing assumptions about the world, which could possibly cause them to show less prejudice towards groups they are predisposed to dislike. On the other hand, other research has shown that anxiety can trigger a biased information search. So you start trying to find all the information you can about these groups, and what you do is you look for biased information. That's what has the most impact. So you're going to remember and search out information that shows that, immigrants are a danger, or that, the 1% is a danger, things like that. So in other words, while we know that anger tends to uniformly increase, my notes are causing me problems. While anger uniformly causes increases in prejudice, we're not sure what effect anxiety is going to have. And I do want to take a moment to emphasize that in our approach, emotions interact with prior attitudes towards social groups. I know I said this before, but this is not kind of like, these emotions are going to cause you to suddenly feel something you didn't already have. So we predict that we also predict that emotions to produce antagonism towards groups will differ depending on, the type of person you are, the type of predispositions you have. So we do predict that liberals and leftists will grow more hostile towards right-leaning groups as well. So party militants of right-wing parties, supporters of right-wing politicians, social groups on the right, maybe such as conservative Christians or economic elites. While people on the right will be more aggressive towards minority groups they dislike and cultural liberals. So this is kind of our fancy chart on this. We predict that exposure to economic threat will produce a negative effect, which is basically just negative emotions, specifically anxiety and anger. So anxiety, the threatening changes in economic circumstances, triggers an information search. And with anger, individuals look to assign blame. So these emotions in turn influence prejudice, but that influence is going to be shaped by pre-existing ideas and narratives about which social groups are one's enemies and one's allies. Now, we use this term loosely to refer to any economic outcome, whether past or present or future, that would broadly be interpreted as negative, undesirable, and harmful. And also the thing is it doesn't have to be an absolute threat, okay? It doesn't have to be you had more money a year ago and now you have less. It has to be that you feel threatened, okay? So you are worried. You maybe be completely and totally middle class, but you're having, middle class anxiety. So how do we test this? Well, so we use two different surveys to test this. One is the Political System Attitude Survey or study. This we did in Spain. It's an observational survey. So basically what we did is we asked a bunch of people about the economy. We asked them how the economy made them feel. And then we asked them some questions about, their ideology and its effect on ethnocentrism. Okay, so you can see the first side, we have left on the x-axis, so left, so it goes left to right for ideology, and the effect of anger goes up and down. And you can see that there are different effects for people on the left versus people on the right. Okay, so we see anger increases prejudice against minorities only among rightists and centrists. Among leftists, this relationship is not significant. And anxiety was always insignificant, so we did not find a statistically significant result with anxiety. Its effect was positive for leftists and negative for for a rightist. Now this is evidence, a little weak though, that the view of anxious information seeking, where rightists will back away from their habitual negative attitudes towards minority, can actually happen. So when they're anxious, because they're going into an information search, they're also not just being exposed to biased information, but they're being exposed to new information. So anxiety can kind of break you from old habits. So you might be more willing to explore new information, whereas anger pretty much solidifies it. Now, this is the one that's probably more interesting to most people here, is we did a mechanical Turk experiment in the United States. And Mechanical Turk is basically, it's an online survey panel through Amazon that people can pay to take a survey. So what we did is, this one we did an experiment. So we stimulated the effects of exposure to an economic threat. And we did this by asking respondents to do one of three writing exercises. We had them write about a time when the economic situation of the country made them anxious or angry, or about a time when they felt that the economic situation was not going very well. So we tried to make them angry, we tried to make them anxious, and then we just tried to threaten them in general. And the control condition, we asked them to think about brushing their teeth. Okay. So the effect of the anger treatment here was significant among those who identified as conservative or extremely conservative. The effect of the neutral treatment was significant among those with scores of 1 to 3, so those that were less than moderate. So these results are consistent with some of our hypothesis. Basically conservatives are becoming, or do seem to become, more prejudicial. They answer that they have more prejudicial attitudes when they have been threatened and are kind of meant to feel angry about it. Now, the results of liberals are much more difficult to interpret than those for conservatives. But when we include both anger and fear in our analysis, we can kind of clarify it a little bit. So the anger treatment observed among conservatives is entirely mediated through anger. But anger strongly influences ethnocentricism, among conservatives. Liberals did not significantly become more ethnocentric in response to either anger or fear. So we can only speculate, to kind of why this is. The lack of an emotional effect when liberals received the neutral treatment, they didn't have an effect on the neutral treatment, suggests that some cognitive effect is in play. Okay. And of course, always when we do this, it's kind of hard to say that maybe liberals are not being more aware of what the quote unquote correct answer is supposed to be when you're asking them about racial bias. So, okay, so let's say you don't really get the charts. What is the main take-home point? Well, our results were consistent with our theory that economic threat influences prejudice through emotions. Yet these effects are conditioned by ideology. Anger promotes prejudice among ethnic and racial against ethnic and racial minorities, but only among conservatives. This is true in both the US and Spain, while somewhat less conclusive evidence suggests that anxiety alone is associated with ethnocentrism among liberals. This suggests that both motivational and cognitive effects of emotion play a role in shaping ethnocentric attitudes. So, another key thing to state is that while we find that emotions serve as an important predictor of how economic crises influence people, they are not the only explanation. Unfortunately, people are very complicated. So generally, economic troubles retain some predictive power. So if you are having some economic problems, that will cause your prejudice levels and things like that going down above and beyond the emotional response. So there are likely a lot of different causal mechanisms operating at once. And this work is basically a way to kind of start to disentangle how economic crisis can influence prejudicial attitudes. So on that note, I'm going to end the talk. Thank you very much. I know we have a lot of questions to get to, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to Asher.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Navarre. A lot of things. I took some notes here. Very interesting. You brought up the idea of economic threat, anxiety, and anger. It's connected to this idea, this notion of biased political beliefs, voting, you name it. And something that really touched upon something I would say that resonates with me is anger is almost like a solidification of that original thought process. I'm thinking concrete. And then when I think of this notion of anxiety, there's more of a potential to be open, maybe the possibility of hope. So I have a couple of questions for you. Why do you believe that politics is so important to young voters?
I mean, why is politics is important to young voters? Because no matter what your profession is, no matter what your goals are, politics is going to have an effect on you. There's a saying I've heard that you might not be interested in politics, but politics is interested in you. And that is true. There's a classic definition of politics as who gets what, where, and why. And that's another thing. So if you are a student at a university, a community college, a state university, in a state, what classes you have to take, how much money that university or college gets from the state, all of that's decided by politics. In fact, it's being decided by politics right now. The discussion for the budget for the schools, for higher ed in Massachusetts is being debated right now. And we're going to find out whether or not these schools will be able to maintain the level of funding that they had last year, whether or not there's going to be drastic cuts. So there's that. In Massachusetts and other schools, I went to the University of Texas for my graduate school. You have to take a government class in order to graduate. Who decided that? Lawmakers. So if you don't like the fact that you have to take government class, who do you complain to? Lawmakers. If you are a teacher, if you're going to be a teacher, well, Common Core, testing, all of that, who is deciding that? Who is setting these regulations? Politicians. So even if you think you're not interested in politics, politics will be interested in you. Cash bail, issues of marijuana. Should marijuana be legal or illegal? Who can you marry? Who can adopt children? Who can put their names on birth certificates? All of these are decisions that are being decided by politicians. And so if you don't get involved in politics, then someone else will be making those decisions for you. And while it's hard to see how one person can make a difference on the national level, which, let's be honest, you're in Massachusetts, or most people in Cape Cod Community College are going to be in Massachusetts. Massachusetts is going to go blue. Okay, so you might not have, and because of the Electoral College, if you're a Republican especially, you're not going to have that great of influence on who wins president. But your local elections, your state level elections, that matters. And those people, that's where one vote can really have an impact on the outcome. And one vote can really impact your livelihood or your community, how much you get paid, minimum wage laws, all that's done on a state and local level. So that's why I think young people should get involved in politics, because young people are the most populist generation compared to baby boomers, they're pretty much equal to baby boomers right now.
Thank you. That's it's very interesting. What really resonated with me, what you said, is politics is interested in you. So it really doesn't matter if you're interested or not.
Mhm.
When I was going to graduate school, one of the things that I noticed is there weren't a lot of students of color that were taking on political science majors. And I'd like to present that question to you. Why do you think that so few students of color go into graduate school to study political science?
So this, of course, is a very complex problem. And it's one that, fortunately, though, has been getting a lot of attention, and people are looking to rectify the situation. Unfortunately, it is pretty bad. Someone just came out with a table of how many Black and Latino students were graduated from PhD programs in the United States, the top 20 PhD programs. And I think it was like the last 15 years. UT had one, and I'm not sure if they counted if it's someone who is Afro-Latina who came from the Dominican Republic. So I'm not actually sure if a person of African descent born in the United States has actually graduated from the University of Texas PhD program in the past 15 years, which is a pretty damning statistic. So I think there's a lot of different pressures. One is, people come from very different backgrounds. And because there are fewer African Americans in the academy already, you have fewer African Americans that are children of professors. And children of professors do tend to be professors. That is a higher rate. So more professors, being a first generation professor, it's not unheard of. I am a first generation professor. It sounds so weird. But there are a sizable percent of people that are. So there's a lot of people that don't know about graduate school. There's a lot of people that don't understand how it works or understand how to apply. And unless you get in with a professor that is willing to teach you this or willing to show you this, if you don't have family, you're kind of flailing about figuring out yourself. And so there are a lot of other socioeconomic issues that go into it as well. And also the pressure of, if you show up and you're the only Black face in your program, and your program could also be in some place that's not very friendly to people of color, you're going to have a lot of different issues to deal with than white students might. And I think that can create a very difficult environment for students of color, and especially when you're kind of looking at the idea of neutrality in political science. We have this idea of neutrality that we're going to just look at the data and not be political. Well, if you're coming from different viewpoints and different ways of experiencing society, your idea of what political is might be different. And so when you bring up, hey, this sort of politics really impacts me and my family, you might get dismissed. Well, that's not the sort of thing we study here. That's anthropology or that's sociology. So I think those sorts of things can make it difficult for someone to want to continue in the program, even if they get in. But there are changes. There are people of color know stuff is a group of people of color in political science that put together a large list of well, not just African Americans or but people of color that are experts in different areas. This is modeled on the Women Also Know Stuff, which is a list of focusing on women as well who are experts in the political science field.
Awesome. Thank you. Here's one that's quite interesting that we have struggled with as a nation, the idea of fake news in politics. Can you talk about how this might impact censorship and the impact of suppressing conflicts?
So this is a very interesting question because we could take it a lot of different ways.
Mhm.
So a lot of times when you hear censorship, people think, it's the government saying you can't speak on anything. But we also have this idea of, people feeling that they can't talk about things. So what we can have is we can have this idea of people choosing not to discuss stuff, people choosing to kind of push stuff below and not really deal with the issue at hand or really debate these issues that are super important. People don't want to have conversations about race and politics or prejudice in politics because it's really uncomfortable. So you can kind of create this sort of self censorship um, that can create problems when we're trying to discuss different things. But I think another thing too with fake news, what's interesting is we're seeing, fake news is very much problematic in that if people are afraid or anxious, if they're anxious and they're doing an information search, they're looking for information and they're exposed to information that's fake or misleading or that's meant to be more propaganda-ish, that can cause them, because of their emotional state, to gravitate to that information and use that information to create their biases. So when they're then examining politics and policies, which policies they prefer, they're going to be doing that through a lens of with not the full information that they need or with sort of misleading information helping them make that decision. So that's what I see as interesting with fake news right now. And once again, fake news or conspiracies, what conspiracy you believe, like there are certain things that we think that there is kind of a conspiratorial ideation, that some people are going to be more conspiratory minded than others. But which conspiracy you believe is going to depend on your political partisanship behavior. Democrats believe in certain conspiracy theories, Republicans believe in other conspiracy theories. And while there is some overlap, on some things, almost everybody has a theory about who shot JFK or the aliens. That's not really partisan as much. Who do you think shot JFK is a very partisan conspiracy theory, will be based on your partisan beliefs.
Wow, thank you. Here's something on the research that you've done with regard to Twitter. You've done some research around the power of Twitter and immigration, particularly in how political powers have used it to speak to the populist. What did you learn from your research?
So I didn't learn anything too terribly surprising when I was studying the 2016 election. So I basically looked at Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump's, Ted Cruz, and Bernie Sanders tweets for a year before the 2016 election. And what I found is there was a clear distinction about the way immigrants were talked about by Democrats and Republicans. And even when you looked, and what I found though that was most interesting is the way they would take the same sort of fact and frame it differently, or the way they would talk about immigrants as an economic issue. On the Democratic side, they would talk about how immigration is an economic issue. It helps build our communities. They pay taxes. They're workers, focusing on that. Whereas on the Republican side, it was immigrants are an economic issue because they will take your jobs, because they don't pay taxes, because they cost us money. And so even when you would see them talking about the same issue, you would see them describing the issue extremely different. There wasn't a lot of middle ground or places to come together on in these two when looking at each side. I had wanted to look and see, I was trying to see whether or not they were, where these frames were coming from. Were they picking them up from people on Twitter, or were they kind of, were they the ones creating them? And I didn't have the information to do that with this study. That requires higher computational power than I had at the time. But what I did find that was interesting is that when they would retweet people, it was to make it sound like people, they have the support. So this is how people in general see this issue. So you would see Hillary Clinton, well, she tended to use people. She didn't tend to retweet people, but she would use people's stories. So Carla is an immigrant, and when we talk about deporting families, we're talking about deporting families like hers. Whereas Donald Trump would tend to retweet people that would say the same things he was saying. We need to build a wall. The only way we can be safe is if we have a wall. Whereas Ted Cruz would retweet other people saying what he said. So congratulating him on saying something. So Ted Cruz was more would retweet, I don't know, I'm trying to think, Fox News host says, Ted Cruz is right on the money about immigration. And then it would have a Ted Cruz quote, which was pretty interesting. And Bernie Sanders didn't really retweet people very much on immigration. So that was an interesting thing. But it wasn't the most used topic on Twitter either. It was right in the middle. But yeah, so that was the other thing.
Thank you so much for that. So last question. You co-authored a paper on measuring and assessing cultural discontent and conspiracies, once again, on populism. What did your research tell you, and what were your conclusions and findings?
Well, so with the cultural discontent, what we were interested in finding out is a lot of times in political science, the idea of cultural discontent is really that you are not happy with the way society is going. You feel like you are a stranger in a strange land. When you look around the country, you feel that politicians don't respect you. You feel that movies don't portray your values. But typically, when this is being measured in a way that really focuses on people on the conservative side, people that are traditionalists. And what we do see this kind of conservative discontent rising in places like with Donald Trump in the United States, UKIP in Britain, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Viktor Orban in Hungary. But what we also notice is that the left is kind of experiencing its own version of cultural discontent. You have the Remainers in the US and the UK, you have progressives in the US, and basically, we kind of looked around and we're like, well, why wouldn't people on the left also feel this sort of displacement? When you look around and see your fellow citizens embracing people or embracing ideas that you feel are contradictory to you. What we're seeing is it appears that we're seeing this kind of cultural discontent on the left. The left is starting to say, hey, no, this isn't who we are either. So what we're seeing is what we think we're seeing is a cultural backlash on the left as well as the right. But unfortunately, all the ways that we currently measure cultural backlash in political science tend to focus just on the right. So that's what this cultural discontent paper was. It was a way of kind of looking at cultural discontent on both the left and the right. So looking a little bit more, what are the things that make people on the left feel discontented with their society, that their society no longer represents them? And what are the things that make people on the right feel discontented or no longer respected by their societies? And so that was what that paper found. And we found that, yes, there does seem to be discontent on both sides. We haven't quite figured out, what came first, the chicken or the egg, but that is sort of what we are working with. And then conspiracies, when it comes to conspiracies, like I said, populism kind of divides the world into an us versus them. And that them has to be working against us. So it seems like populism itself would be it would be connected to conspiracies. That somehow if you became more populist, but through anxiety or your emotional state, that you would also become more open to conspiracies. So what we did is we wanted to look and see, if you increase populist attitudes, will conspiracism also increase, or is it the other way around? So what comes first? Is it increased conspiracism leading to increased populism, or increased populism leading to increased conspiracism? And so what we found, very general, is conspiracism is a byproduct of populist attitudes. People with very negative attitudes towards elites, thinking that the elites, they're working against us, they're working in secret, they're keeping us down. They're the ones that are more likely to believe in conspiracy theories. So if you're worried about conspiracy theories or more people believing conspiracy theories, then the rise of populism is probably a bad sign for you, because so far in this preliminary research, it looks like the more populist people are, the more likely they are to believe and be open to conspiracy theories. However, if you are concerned about populism and think that conspiracy theories, belief in conspiracies is growing, then you're probably better off, because we don't show that increasing belief in conspiracies leads to increasing populism. So it's kind of a more of a little bit of a wonky kind of paper, kind of looking at the weeds of what causes what. But that's what we found, is that even though it seems like they would go together no matter what, it looks like populism does lead to conspiracies, but not the other way around.
Thank you, Dr. Navarre. One of the things I'm getting here, which I think is really important for us to kind of wrap our heads around, is that it seems that we're taking this emotional experience to this notion of politics, whether it be the anxiety that we're feeling or even the anger that we may be dealing with. It seems that that is what we're taking to the polls. And so I think it's as intuitive as it sounds, sometimes we don't see it that way. This afternoon, we're talking about not politics, but political science. It's the study of the politics. And one of the things I would like to say is that this is a very timely conversation, because I think we all know what's happening outside in that national environment, although we're not here today to have a leaning on one side or the other. I'd like to thank you for your time this afternoon. Once again, my name is Asher Hamilton. I'm the coordinator of the Office of Student Engagement. We had a wonderful discussion with Dr. Rachel Navarre from Bridgewater State University. And I'd like to pull a moment here aside to make a plug for the Latinx Heritage Month event. I really think that it's important to talk about celebrating the fortitude, the resilience of Latinx, Hispanic, and Latino identified communities worldwide. Now, when we think about Heritage Months, we have a specific time period, whether it's African American for February or the 15th of September through the 15th of October for the celebration of Latinx Heritage Month. But I believe that these communities, all of these communities, too many, numerous to name here, exist outside of these months. So one of the things that we were very thoughtful and intentional in doing is making sure that we were outside of that. And we made sure that we had these opportunities to speak and to talk about these communities. I'd like to state to you that we have many more of these presentations that will be happening over the next few days. For instance, tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock, we have Disrupting Anti-Blackness and Gender Policing. That will be with Kay Martinez. All you need to do is hit on the link, ask for a reservation, and you can come right into our room, much as you have done today. That's 3 o'clock tomorrow. The next day after that, which is Wednesday, we're looking at the relationships between race, power, and privilege in the production of media images regarding storytelling of what is Latinx. That happens tomorrow at 3 o'clock. The next day after that, we're dealing with, actually, that's the next week. We're inviting here the storytelling and what does it mean to be both Hispanic and Latinx. Our last event, which happens next week on Wednesday, is the infamous, famous Dr. Daniel Culion Ramos. He's coming here to speak to us around something very sensitive, but something very, very serious. The inheritance of a narrative of prejudice and loathing, regardless of personal achievements or scientific breakthroughs. What we have here for you is a lineup of speakers who are coming from all over Massachusetts to have some of these conversations that may be difficult or hard to have. But we have them here at 4Cs. I'd like to say thank you to our communication staff who's been doing all the background for this lovely presentation. I'd like to also thank the Office of Student Engagement, the team that works with me. And I'd like to most importantly, thank you. Thank you for this afternoon.